Hey, fifth graders, welcome back to another excerpt from Nowhere Boy. Today's is not going to be as hard as yesterday. That was very emotional read, and it's so upsetting, but it is reality, and it's okay to be upset by that. I enjoyed reading your thoughts on it and sharing the ideas because we can't be there together. So it really helped me to hear that I was not alone in my thoughts. So we're going to pick up today. The lockdown has ended, and I was looking up the Magritte. There's a famous surrealist painter that the author references that's very close to Ahmed's heart, Rene Magritte. And I was looking up some of his paintings because they're described in the next couple of chapters. And I went on Katherine Marsh, the author's website, and she actually has a YouTube video about fun ways to survive a lockdown. So I linked that in our slideshow, on our Nowhere Boy slideshow. It's right on the first page. So definitely check that out. And she has some funny things there and some good tips for surviving a lockdown. Because, of course, they're in a lockdown for a very different reason, but there are common elements. So let's see what happens today. Chapter 24. The next morning, the lockdown ended, even though the missing terrorist was still in the loose. The police claimed that he'd most likely left the city, but Max suspected that the government officials who had approved the lockdown were just as tired of being cooped up inside as he was. And of course, fifth graders, they weren't even locked down as long as us, but we're tired of it too. But an armed police officer, thankfully not Fontaine, stood outside the entrance of the School of Misery, and even parents were no longer allowed inside the building. This seemed to reassure his mother, who had wavered about sending him back, but she still gave him an extra tight hug at the courtyard entrance. Max pulled away. "I'm in more danger from this one stupid Belgian kid than I am from a terrorist," he murmured. The crinkles in his mother's brow deepened. "You didn't tell us someone was bothering you. What's he doing?" "Just teasing," Max lied. "It's no big deal." It is a big deal, fifth graders, right? I think he should have told. His mom studied his face. "Don't take things into your own hands, okay, Max? If this continues, tell me, and I'll talk to Madame Legrand." Max instantly regretted mentioning Oscar. The last thing he needed was his mom stepping in to defend him. "Really, it's nothing." His mom nodded like she wanted to believe him, but Max wondered if she just didn't want another problem on her hands. "Maybe he just wants to be friends," she said. "Some boys don't know how except by acting out." Is that good advice, you think? Is that something a parent would say? Probably. Max was tempted to remind her that her experience with school was like a century old. Besides which she couldn't possibly understand a thug like Oscar. But instead, he just smiled. "Yeah, that's probably it." Before he could dart away, she lunged forward and gave him a kiss. At least it wasn't as embarrassing in Belgium as it would have been in America. "Relax," he mumbled. "I'll be fine." His mom wasn't the only one who was nervous about a terror attack. Several kids, including Farah, were missing from Max's class, either because half the metro lines were still closed or because their parents were too worried to send them. Max wished he'd asked Farah for a number so he could text her about how weird school felt after the lockdown. Every time there was a police siren or a loud noise outside, everyone froze, even Oscar, and looked as if they were deciding whether to duck under their desks. Fifth graders, I wonder what it will be like for us when we eventually get back in the classroom, how different and weird it will be. But then Max thought about how this experience was nothing compared to Ahmed's daily life in Syria. He imagined a bomb blowing up Claire and his mother. It was too horrible to think about, even before he reminded himself that Ahmed had somehow lost his father too. Max wanted to ask him about this, but he figured it was better to let Ahmed tell him when he was ready. As Madame Legrand reviewed how to balance an equation, love that, Max thought about how math always had rules. Yay, that's what we love about it, right, fifth graders? Equations had to balance to make sense, but what kind of sense did Ahmed's life make? Most people would probably live and die without knowing 1/100th of the sorrow and tragedy Ahmed had already experienced. Where was the balance in that? Max knew one answer. He'd heard his father say it 1,000 times. Life isn't fair. But thinking about this just made him angry. It seemed less a fact than an excuse, a way to let others be losers and victims and to not try to change anything. But what could he do to change Ahmed's life? Right now, Max couldn't think of a single way to help with his future, much less change his past. And fifth graders, can you make fairness? Like, I know the country is battling with that too right now. Things are not fair for so many groups of people. And how do we fix that? At recess, Max climbed up on the fence so he could peer at his house. A slanted ray of sun cut through the clouds, illuminating the garden. The vines were tangled, the bushes were overgrown, and dried leaves littered the ground. What cheer there was came from bright green birds that twittered in the trees overhead. Max pictured Ahmed in the wine cellar as much of a prisoner as the cage man in the Magritte painting. I'll have to Google that painting, fifth graders, and I'll add it to the slideshow, okay? What are you doing? Asked a sharp voice behind him. Max hopped down to the asphalt, ready for trouble, but he noticed that Oscar looked tired, like he had spent too many nights up late listening to the news. I look at my house. You scared? Want to go home? But Oscar's taunt was so far from the truth that Max realized it didn't bother him. No, he said simply. Oscar didn't say anything. He just stood there. What did he want now? Max thought. What did he want now? Max thought about what his mom had said. Maybe he just wants to be friends, but he pushed it away. Oscar was probably just waiting for him to come up with another angrier comeback, so he had an excuse to take a swing at him. But that wasn't going to happen. Oscar couldn't upset him, not anymore. Max calmly looked him straight in the face until Oscar walked away. It was at that moment that Max made up his mind. If only for a day, he would find a way to get Ahmed outside. So there you go. That's the end of that chapter. I'm going to keep reading, but I'm thinking a couple things here, fifth graders. Why does Oscar lose his power to upset Max anymore? I mean, that's a pretty big step. Max has taken back his power, and Oscar doesn't have that control over him anymore. How come that is happening? And then I was also thinking, remember at the beginning of the book when it had to mean something that the author put the school right next to Max's house, and why the author would choose to do that, because that is not typical. You don't typically live across the street from your school. So that's going to play a role. So be thinking about that too. Chapter 25. From Max, as well as from the English language newspapers he took from the recycling bin to wrap the orchids, Ahmed knew all of Europe was on alert. Police and security were everywhere, and the idea of trying to go to Calais or anywhere else seemed preposterous. So fifth graders, Max wants to get Ahmed out, even if it's for a day. But if the whole city is still on high alert, how is he going to do that? I mean, Ahmed is 14. They're searching anybody that looks Arab-like, which is bad. So how do you think that might play out? Ahmed focused on his daily routine in the cellar, and with each day that passed, the outside world seemed to fade. He practiced his English reading, tending the orchids, and ate small meals, staring at the picture of the man whose torso was a cage. Sorry, I have something in my mouth. While Max was at school, Ahmed teased out details he hadn't noticed before. How the man was carrying a beat-up traveler's sack laced together. How a red cape, almost like a dress, obscured his face. So this is in the painting. He's studying it. Sometimes when the house was empty, Ahmed hid himself behind the curtains of the storage room that faced the garden so he could look out the window. The days had grown extremely short. Max and his family left for school and work in the dark, and the sun was already starting to set around 3:30 in the afternoon when Ahmed heard Max return home. Ahmed had never lived in a place with such a long night, but in a way he didn't mind. He felt safer in the shadows, and you can be thinking about why that might be. I would think he wouldn't feel as safe at night because the family is home, but let's see. One Tuesday afternoon in the middle of December, Ahmed heard the front door open, the sign that Max and Madame Pauline were home. Max had warned Ahmed to stay quiet when Madame Pauline was there, so he was surprised a moment later when Max pounded on his door, shouting his name. Was the police officer back? Had he been discovered? I keep thinking of the World War II when the Jewish boy, right, man, was hiding in the basement, and how scary that must be when you hear someone coming down and banging on the door. Ahmed grabbed the bag he always kept packed and ran to the door. But when he wrenched it open, he found Max dressed in his jacket, holding a puffy parka and striped hat. What has happened? Ahmed whispered. You don't have to whisper, Max said. Madame Pauline isn't here today. Where is she? There's a metro strike, so she called this morning to say she couldn't come. So there's a strike, subway strike. And your parents? Ahmed had noticed that Max's parents never seemed to leave him alone, although he was certainly old enough. In Syria, kids far younger than Max cared for smaller children. There's a little cultural difference for you. I was the one who answered the phone, and I didn't tell them. We have 2 hours till Claire gets back, so we'd better get going. Oh, so he didn't tell his parents that Madame Pauline didn't come today. So they have 2 hours before his parents get home and his sister gets home. Ahmed pulled away confused. What? Where? It's a surprise. That police officer, what if he see me? Max smiled. He works for the local police and we're getting out of his territory. But if we do run into him, I'll just tell him you're a friend from school, okay? Just don't say too much. But look, you've got to get out of here just for a few hours. You'll be safe with me. Here, take my dad's coat and hat. It's chilly out there. Ahmed's instinct told him to stay put, but the thought of the outside, of the ordinary world where people lived beautiful, ordinary lives, beckoned. The lockdown was over, he told himself, and being out with a white American boy would be less suspicious than wandering around the city alone. Besides, he was curious to see what Max wanted to show him. Ahmed slipped on the coat, pulled the cap low over his forehead, and followed Max up the stairs. It felt strange to walk out the front door as if the house was his, and then to stand in front of it so openly as Max unlocked a shiny red mountain bike chained to the neighbor's gate. The afternoon light was already dim, the roofline of the block in silhouette against sunset-tinged yellow clouds. Ahmed drew in a deep breath of cold air, then breathed it out in a damp cloud. Max wheeled the bike to the side bar and took hold of the handlebars. Sit on the seat and hold on to my shoulders. Ahmed did as he was instructed, and Max pushed off the side bike. Off the sidewalk. The bike wobbled, nearly toppling them over before Max brought his foot down on one pedal, then the other. As the bike righted itself and picked up speed, Ahmed remembered the magical rush of watching the streets of Aleppo sail by as he rode side saddle on the back of Baba's bike, one hand clutching his father's shirt. Well, that's certainly a nice memory for him. Excuse me. A bump jostled him out of the past as the bike leapt off the curb, and Max steered it down a one-way street. They picked up speed on the downhill, and Max stopped pedaling and coasted. At the bottom of the hill, a park with a dry fountain came into view. That's Parc du Cinquantenaire, Max said. As Max steered onto a bike path that ran alongside the park, Ahmed peered through the gates at an enormous arch topped with rearing bronze horses pulling a chariot. They passed a running track, ball court, and playground. It was the first time he'd really been able to tour Brussels by day. Just past the playground, he spotted a minaret, the crescent moon resting calmly atop it. Ahmed stared at the circular white building as out of place as himself. Max glanced back at him. That's the Great Mosque of Brussels. Do you want to go in? So that's a religious building for Muslims, similar to like a church or a temple. They call it a mosque. Soon it would be time for the Maghrib prayer, but Ahmed shook his head. What if he ran into Amir, the smuggler, or if police kept an eye on who went inside? Max pedaled on across a large avenue lined with office buildings. The street was jammed, and Max was silent and focused, his head constantly swiveling to watch the cars and buses that crept alongside them. Military police, assault rifles slung against their fatigues, stood outside various official-looking buildings, flying the European Union flag with its white stars in a circle against a field of blue. Ahmed noticed each policeman, then tried not to. Max pedaled around a traffic circle and in between an enormous curving building surrounded by flags and cement barricades and another imposing building with a facade of glass windows. That's the European Commission and the European Council, Max said. In an island between them were 4 military vehicles with soldiers sitting inside or stretched out in the back smoking. For a moment, Ahmed felt as if he was back in Aleppo at the very beginning of the war. But the soldiers paid him no attention. Ahmed felt almost giddy as Max glided over a bridge, past the English word mad, scrawled in giant graffiti letters on the side of a building, past the entrance to Melbeek metro station. Max rang his bell at pedestrians who'd wandered into the bike lane, and Ahmed felt the thrill of watching them scurry out of the way. After nearly a month inside, he was out in the fresh air and wind, cold as it was. He tilted his head back and looked up at the darkening sky. It felt wrong when his family was dead, but he couldn't help thinking, I'm alive. Oh, he feels good, 5th graders, but he feels guilty too. They crossed a large intersection jammed with cars and taxis, their headlights shining. After a few minutes, the street turned from asphalt to cobblestone, and they bumped into a square lit up by old-fashioned street lamps. One whole side of it was occupied by a grand building with Roman columns, a domed clock tower, and a cross. Max pulled up to the sidewalk across from it and jumped down. That's the Royal Palace, he said. Is that where we're going? Ahmed asked. Max spun around and pointed to a square classical building behind them. No, there. It's the Magritte Museum. We can find that picture you like. What a thoughtful surprise for Ahmed, 5th graders. Let me try to find some of his paintings and put them in the slideshow. Ahmed stared at him. The whole idea of taking such a risk, of venturing out of the safety of the cellar just to go to an art museum, was extravagant, indulgent, as mad as the graffiti. What? Max asked. I love it, Ahmed said with a grin. Max locked up the bike and led him into a large foyer where they had to walk through a metal detector. Ahmed's heart fluttered as he passed, imagining the guard stopping him, but the machine didn't beep. He had no metal. He followed Max into another hall to the information desk where Max bought them tickets and asked directions. They were just ordinary tourists looking at art. Never been here, Max explained as they stepped into a room-sized elevator and handed their tickets to the operator. He opened the door on the top floor. Through glass windows, Ahmed could see the entire city of Brussels, the fairy tale towers, old European squares, modern office buildings and domes spread out before him. It was strange and wonderful to be so high after months of being so low. Ready? Max asked. They opened a set of glass doors and strode into an exhibit hall where an illuminated plaque in French, Dutch, and English told the story of René Magritte's life, the artist. Ahmed started to read the English. Magritte was born in Hainaut, Belgium, the oldest son of Leopold and Regina. When he was 14 years old, his mother drowned herself in the river Sambre. Her body was found with her nightgown covering her face. But it was the word drowned that struck Ahmed like a blow. And I have seen some Magritte paintings, 5th graders, and in some the faces are covered. And I wonder if that is in homage to his mama, the Magritte's mama. Do you understand? Max asked. Too well. He's had an experience with almost drowning, yes. And his papa. Too well, Ahmed wanted to say, but he just nodded and moved on to Magritte's pictures. The exhibit was like walking through a hall of funhouse mirrors reflecting his dreams and nightmares. There was a jumbled pile of townhouses, not unlike the one he was hiding in, some on their sides, some upside down like buildings in Aleppo. There was an empty picture frame on the beach with a gray sea blending into a gray sky behind it. There was a man asleep in a coffin-like wooden box, an enormous boulder balanced above him. Now that's a strong image. As they wandered from hall to hall, from floor to floor, Max told him that the plaques explained that Magritte was a surrealist, an artist interested in the relationship between reality and illusion. But Ahmed knew that this fancy term concealed something more basic. From all the pictures of women with their faces covered by cloth, Ahmed could tell that Magritte longed for his mother. Oh, fifth graders, that is so heartbreakingly sad. I'm going to read that again. It's such a beautiful emotion from that writing. From all the pictures of women with their faces covered by cloth, Ahmed could tell that Magritte longed for his mother. They continued down to the final floor, but found only a gift shop. Max frowned. Your picture's not here. Maybe we missed it. Ahmed knew they hadn't, but Max insisted on asking a woman in the gift shop. After she replied in French, Max turned to Ahmed. I'm sorry, she said it's in a private collection. He truly looked disappointed, but Ahmed didn't mind that the picture wasn't there. What touched him was how Max had wanted the outing to be perfect. No, sorry, please. I love this. Max looked at his watch. We better get back soon. Wait, Ahmed said. One other thing I wish to see. And I'm going to do one more chapter because it's super short, okay? Chapter 26. As Max, I wonder what he wants to see. Any ideas? I'm wondering if it's the park. As Max pedaled down Rue Vergot, Rue means street in French. Ahmed told Max about the terrifying night with the smuggler. Oh, he's going to tell him about that. How Amir had taken his phone and demanded his father's watch. How he had barely escaped the van. Then he pointed out the house whose gate he had run through 3 months earlier. Max tried to imagine himself in Ahmed's shoes, scrambling up the garden wall when the neighbor's light switched on, drenched and stumbling through the tangle of weeds and bushes towards the basement door. It seemed like fate now that his father had forgotten to lock it. What other book talked about fate a lot, fifth graders, is one of the themes to explore? Holes, right? But it wasn't the gate that Ahmed wanted to see. A few seconds later, Max squeezed the brakes and they drifted to a stop in front of his school. From the outside, there wasn't much to see, just the cement facade of the building and windows rising up floor after floor. The lights were still on inside for the aftercare program, but the doors were locked. And when he and Ahmed pressed their faces up against the glass, all they could see was the brown tile foyer and the plastic bins of the lost and found. For the second time that day, Max felt as if he'd let Ahmed down. But when Ahmed finally pulled away from the glass, his face was relaxed, even peaceful. I look back at school for many weeks. Now I can know how it looks from the front. And we know, fifth graders, that his family, Ahmed and his family, valued education so much. They even went when Syria was in a war, even when there was bombings, they went to school. That shows you how valuable they think education is. Let's see if it changes Max's perspective a little bit. 3 months earlier, Max never would have understood such an urge. If he could have left school forever, if someone had told him he could stay home all day and hang out and play Minecraft, he would have done it in a heartbeat. But that had been before the long, dull days of the lockdown, when school was closed not for a vacation or a snowy day, but because it was no longer safe. I can't help thinking, fifth graders, I bet there are many that thought, oh, this break from school is so great. I hate school. It's so much work. It's so tiring. And now I think we all are in a place where we're just, I've always been in a place where I desperately want to go back, but maybe you're in that place now too. How long has it been since you went to school? He asked. Real school? 3 years. 3 years without school, fifth graders. Max stared at him stunned. When did you leave Syria? A month after bomb. In refugee camp in Turkey, there is school, but too many people. We no can stay. In Izmir, I help at bakery. Father works construction building till we can pay for fake passport and smuggler to Europe. There is no time for school. It's so sad. Max pressed his face back against the glass, pretending to try the door again, but he was really trying to hide the tears that were welling up in his eyes. He had always taken school for granted. Now he realized that even being able to hate it was a luxury. Max stared bitterly at his own reflection as the old, angry protest rose to his lips. It's not fair. Ahmed deserved to go to school. It was at that very moment that the idea came to him. He spun around. What if you go to school again? What? Ahmed's thick eyebrows knitted together in confusion. Then he seemed to decide Max was joking because he laughed. No, really, Max said. What if you start here as a new student in January? Still smiling, Ahmed just shook his head. With no document? You said you had a forged passport, Max said, thinking out loud. If you got this far, what are the chances the school would be able to tell? And the Belgian identification card for foreign kids? It's just paper with a photo. It's not even electronic. We could make one ourselves. Max knew the idea was a fantasy, but it felt better to come up with a crazy plan than to do nothing. Ahmed must have felt the same way because he played along. If I leave before dawn by back door, no one see me. Max nodded. And I can make sure the coast is clear. I mean, no one is looking, so you can sneak back in after school. What about police officer? Same plan as before. If he sees you, I'll tell him you're my best friend from school. It's a lot less suspicious than being some kid I can't explain sneaking around my garden. Ahmed grinned. We will become very good friends. Two foreign kids who don't speak much French. It makes sense. Could they pull it off? Max was actually beginning to think they could. Going back to school would change Ahmed's life in a way that really mattered. Max waved him onto the bike. Come on, let's try to forge that ID. So I'm going to stop there, fifth graders, but let's see if tomorrow they can pull it off, okay? Let me know your thoughts in the shared drive, and don't fall behind in this read aloud. It's too important, okay? Bye, sweet kids.